Welcome to our channel, where today we're exploring some of the most chilling stories from the Appalachian Trail. These tales come from various social media platforms like Reddit's r, No Sleep, and hiking forums, where outdoor enthusiasts share their unexplained experiences. The Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,190 miles through 14 states, from Georgia to Maine, winding through some of the oldest mountains in North America. Every year, thousands of hikers attempt to conquer this legendary path, either in sections or as through hikers, completing the entire journey. For most, it's an adventure filled with beauty and personal achievement. But for others, their time on the trail becomes marked by encounters they cannot explain. Our first story comes from a solo hiker named James, who was in his late 20s when he decided to tackle a 200-mile section of the trail through the Great Smoky Mountains. James had been an avid day hiker for years, but had never attempted a multi-week journey before. He prepared meticulously, studying maps and trail guides, gathering lightweight gear, and training with a loaded pack for months before his departure. The first few days on the trail were everything he had hoped for, with breathtaking vistas, peaceful solitude, and the simple rhythm of walking from sunrise to sunset. He would occasionally cross paths with other hikers, exchanging brief greetings or sharing meals at designated campsites before continuing on his solitary journey through the ancient forest. On the fifth night, James made camp near a small stream about half a mile from the nearest shelter. He had pushed himself harder than usual that day, covering nearly 20 miles of difficult terrain, and decided to set up his tent early rather than push onto the crowded shelter ahead. As dusk settled over the mountains, he cooked a simple meal on his portable stove and listened to the gentle sounds of the forest around him. The temperature dropped quickly as darkness fell, and James retreated into his tent with a book, planning to read until sleep overtook him. Around midnight, he was awakened by what sounded like footsteps circling his tent, slow and deliberate, crunching on the fallen leaves that carpeted the forest floor. At first, he assumed it was a deer, or perhaps another nocturnal animal foraging nearby. James called out softly, thinking it might be another hiker who had lost their way in the darkness. There was no response, but the footsteps stopped immediately. After several minutes of silence, James convinced himself it had indeed been an animal and tried to return to sleep. Just as he was drifting off, the footsteps returned, closer this time, and with a more purposeful rhythm that seemed distinctly human. James felt his heart rate quicken as he reached for his flashlight and knife, the only potential weapons he had brought with him. The footsteps continued to circle his tent, occasionally stopping directly outside the thin fabric wall that separated James from whatever was out there. He remained frozen in his sleeping bag, afraid that any movement might provoke whatever was stalking him in the darkness. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, James gathered his courage and called out more forcefully, demanding to know who was there. Again, the footsteps stopped abruptly at the sound of his voice. This time, however, instead of silence, James heard what sounded like someone or something retreating rapidly through the underbrush, branches snapping and leaves rustling as it moved away from his campsite. When dawn finally broke, James packed up his gear with trembling hands and hiked as quickly as possible to the next shelter, where he found a group of 4 other hikers preparing their morning coffee. When he described his experience, one of the older hikers, a woman who had completed the entire trail twice before, nodded knowingly and told him he wasn't the first to report such an encounter in that section of the trail. There are stories about a figure that watches hikers from a distance, she explained, pouring James a cup of coffee from her small pot. Some call it the shadow walker because it's only ever seen in silhouette or at the edges of visibility, never approaches directly, never makes contact, just watches and follows until you reach certain boundaries. The other hikers listened intently, some nodding in agreement, while others looked skeptical. James wasn't sure what to believe, but the woman's matter-of-fact tone and the seriousness with which she spoke left him unsettled. He asked if anyone knew the origin of this shadow walker or what it might want from hikers it followed. Some say it's the spirit of a hiker who died on the trail and never completed their journey, another man in the group offered. Others think it's something older, something that was here long before the trail was established, something that doesn't appreciate humans passing through its territory. James spent that night at the shelter with the other hikers, drawing comfort from their presence. For the remainder of his journey, he avoided camping alone and made sure to reach proper shelters each night before darkness fell. Though he never again experienced anything like that night of circling footsteps, he often felt watched during the quiet afternoon hours when the trail wound through particularly dense sections of forest, and sometimes caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of his peripheral vision. James completed his section hike as planned, but the experience left him with a lingering unease about the trail. He still hikes regularly, but has never returned to that particular section of the Appalachian Trail. When asked if he believes in the supernatural, James hesitates before answering, "I don't know what was outside my tent that night. It could have been another hiker playing a cruel prank, or my imagination amplifying the normal sounds of the forest at night. But something about the way it moved, the deliberate nature of those footsteps, and how it reacted when I spoke, it didn't feel human. And sometimes, in dreams, I still hear those footsteps circling, coming closer and closer, until I wake up in a cold sweat." Our second story takes us farther north on the trail, to the remote wilderness of Maine, where the Appalachian Trail reaches its northern terminus at Mount Katahdin. Sarah and Michael, experienced backpackers in their mid-30s, were celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary with a 2-week hike through what many consider the most challenging section of the entire trail. Both were in excellent physical condition and had completed numerous multi-day hikes before, including sections of the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide. They had carefully planned their itinerary to include some of the most scenic areas while allowing for flexibility in case of bad weather or unexpected challenges along the way. The couple's journey began smoothly, with perfect early autumn weather and spectacular views of the changing foliage that painted the mountains in vibrant reds and golds. On their 4th day out, they entered a particularly isolated stretch where they expected to go several days without encountering other hikers. The terrain became increasingly difficult, with steep ascents followed by treacherous descents over rock fields and gnarled tree roots. Despite the challenges, Sarah and Michael maintained good spirits, taking frequent breaks to rest and enjoy the pristine wilderness surrounding them. That evening, they made camp near a small mountain pond, setting up their tent on a flat area about 50 yards from the water's edge. After dinner, as they sat watching the sunset reflect on the pond's surface, Sarah noticed something odd about the shoreline opposite their campsite. There were tracks, she would later recall in her trail journal. Not animal tracks, at least not any animal I could identify. They were spaced like human footprints, but elongated and deeper at one end, almost as if someone had been walking on the tips of unusually shaped feet. Michael, more skeptical by nature, suggested they might be distorted deer or moose tracks, perhaps altered by the soft mud of the shoreline. As darkness fell, they retreated to their tent, zipping themselves securely inside against the dropping temperature and increasing wind that had begun to whistle through the surrounding trees. Around 2 a.m, both Sarah and Michael were awakened by splashing sounds coming from the pond, thinking it might be a moose or deer coming to drink. Michael cautiously unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. What he saw in the moonlight made him freeze in place. Standing knee-deep in the water was a tall, thin figure that appeared to be drinking or perhaps washing something in the pond. Its proportions seemed wrong, somehow. Limbs too long, head too small for its body. But in the dim light, details were difficult to discern. Michael quickly zipped the tent closed again and whispered to Sarah what he had seen, suggesting they remain quiet and wait for whatever it was to leave. For the next hour, they lay in tense silence, listening as the splashing continued intermittently, sometimes closer to their campsite, sometimes farther away. Eventually, the sounds ceased, and an unnatural silence settled over the area. No insect sounds, no rustling leaves, not even the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Just complete, oppressive silence. Sarah later described it as the absence of sound so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Neither of them slept for the remainder of the night, lying awake with their headlamps and hiking poles close at hand, ready to defend themselves if necessary. When morning finally came, they emerged cautiously from their tent to find a series of the same unusual tracks leading from the pond directly toward their campsite, stopping just yards from where they had slept. The tracks then circled their tent completely before heading back to the water. Sarah took several photos of the tracks with her smartphone, intending to show them to a park ranger or wildlife expert when they reached civilization again. But when they reviewed the photos later, the images showed only indistinct depressions in the mud. Nothing like the clear, disturbing prints they both remembered seeing. They packed up quickly that morning, eager to put distance between themselves and the pond, pushing themselves to hike farther than they had planned for that day. That evening, they reached a designated camping area where they found 2 other groups of hikers already set up for the night. The presence of others brought immense relief, and after some hesitation, they shared their experience with a retired biology professor who was completing a section hike. The professor listened without interruption, then told them about Native American legends from the region that spoke of water people, or the tall ones, who were said to inhabit remote ponds and lakes. According to these stories, these beings were neither malevolent nor benign, but simply territorial, occasionally curious about human visitors, but generally preferring to remain unseen. The tribes that lived here had specific protocols for traveling through certain areas, the professor explained. Offerings would be left, or songs sung to announce their presence and request safe passage. Sarah and Michael completed the remainder of their hike without further incident, though both admitted to feeling on edge whenever their path brought them near bodies of water, especially in the early morning or evening hours. They never did get a satisfactory explanation for what they had encountered that night, and the photos that should have documented the strange tracks remained frustratingly inconclusive. Yet the experience bonded them in an unexpected way, a shared mystery that they occasionally revisit in quiet conversations, particularly when camping in remote areas. We're more observant now, Michael reflected a year after their experience, more aware that the wilderness holds secrets that don't always fit into our understanding of what's possible or rational. Our final story comes from a group of college friends who decided to hike a popular section of the trail in Virginia during their spring break. There were 5 of them: Jason, Emma, Tyler, Madison, and Chris, all in their early 20s and relatively inexperienced in backcountry hiking. They had planned a 4-day, 3-night trip, keeping their daily mileage modest to accommodate their varying fitness levels and to allow time for enjoying the experience rather than rushing from point to point. Their route included several well-maintained shelters where they planned to spend each night, sharing space with other hikers rather than carrying tents. The weather forecast promised mild spring conditions, perfect for their adventure. The first day and night went exactly as planned. They covered about 8 miles of relatively easy terrain, reached their intended shelter by mid-afternoon, and spent a pleasant evening sharing stories with 2 older thru-hikers who were making their way north from Georgia. The second day began equally well, with clear skies and temperatures in the mid-60s, ideal hiking weather. By early afternoon, however, the weather began to change dramatically. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them a sharp drop in temperature and the distant rumble of thunder. The group increased their pace, hoping to reach the next shelter before the storm hit in full force. They were still about 2 miles from their destination when the rain began, starting as a light drizzle, but quickly intensifying into a heavy downpour accompanied by strong gusts of wind. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed almost immediately by deafening thunder that echoed through the mountains. Visibility dropped significantly, and the trail became slick with mud and running water. "We need to find shelter now," Jason shouted over the storm, consulting their map for alternatives. According to their guide, there was an older, unmaintained shelter about half a mile ahead, marked as not recommended in their trail guide, but potentially offering some protection from the increasingly dangerous weather. With few options and the storm worsening by the minute, they decided to risk the unofficial shelter rather than continue to their original destination. They left the main trail at the point indicated on their map, following a barely visible side path that wound through dense undergrowth. After several hundred yards of difficult hiking through mud and tangled vegetation, they came upon a small clearing containing a dilapidated wooden structure that barely deserved the name shelter. It was more of a three-sided shack with a partially collapsed roof, clearly abandoned for many years. Despite its poor condition, it offered some protection from the rain and wind. And with night approaching and the storm showing no signs of abating, they decided to make the best of their situation. Inside, they found evidence of previous visitors, old food wrappers, an abandoned sleeping pad rotted with mold, and various pieces of trash scattered across the dirt floor. There was also a crude fire pit near the open side of the shelter, surrounded by stones blackened from previous fires. Despite the dampness, they managed to get a small fire going using emergency fire starters and relatively dry wood they found stacked in one corner of the shelter. As darkness fell completely, they huddled around the meager flames, eating cold rations from their packs and trying to keep their spirits up despite their uncomfortable circumstances. Around midnight, the storm finally began to subside, the thunder growing more distant and the rain reducing to a gentle patter on what remained of the shelter's roof. It was then, in that moment of relative quiet, that Madison noticed something odd about the far corner of the shelter. "Does anyone else see that?" she whispered, pointing to where the back wall met the side. The others squinted through the dim firelight, trying to make out what had caught her attention. At first, it appeared to be simply a darker patch of shadow, but as they watched, it seemed to shift and change shape subtly, sometimes appearing to extend slightly into the shelter before retreating again. Tyler, the most skeptical of the group, grabbed his flashlight and directed its beam toward the corner. The light revealed nothing unusual, just the rough wooden walls meeting at an angle, with dirt and debris accumulated in the corner. But when he turned the light away, the strange, shadowy movement seemed to resume, visible only indirectly from the corner of one's eye. "It's just the firelight playing tricks," Tyler insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. For the next hour, they all found themselves glancing repeatedly at that corner, some claiming to see the darkness bulge inward toward them, others seeing nothing unusual. Emma, who had been silent for some time, suddenly grabbed Jason's arm with enough force to leave marks. "There's something behind the wall," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Before anyone could respond, they all heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the exterior of the shelter, right where the strange shadow had been seen. The sound moved slowly along the back wall, then up toward what remained of the roof, as if something was carefully feeling its way around the structure. Chris immediately doused the fire, plunging them into near total darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight that now filtered through breaks in the cloud cover. In the new silence, the scratching seemed louder, more deliberate, working its way methodically around the perimeter of the shelter. Then came a new sound, a low, rhythmic breathing, clearly audible outside the open front of the shelter. Madison activated her phone's flashlight and pointed it toward the opening. In the harsh, artificial light, they saw nothing but rain-soaked trees and undergrowth. Yet the breathing continued, seeming to come from just beyond the reach of the light. "Hello?" Jason called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The breathing stopped abruptly, replaced by a complete silence. Then, from much closer than before, they heard a sound that none of them would ever forget. A rasping voice that seemed to contain multiple tones simultaneously, asking in a near whisper, "May I come in?" Terror paralyzed the group momentarily, none of them able to respond or even move. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds before Madison's phone light flickered and went out, leaving them in darkness once again. In that moment, they all felt, rather than saw, something move into the shelter with them, a displacement of air, a subtle change in temperature, a presence that seemed to fill the small space with an oppressive weight. Tyler was the first to react, scrambling to his feet and stumbling toward where he remembered the entrance to be, followed quickly by the others, all grabbing frantically for their backpacks as they fled into the night. They ran blindly through the forest, heedless of the trail or direction, driven solely by the primal need to put distance between themselves and the abandoned shelter. Eventually, they found themselves back on the main trail, guided more by luck than skill, and continued at a brisk pace until they reached the official shelter some 2 miles ahead. There they found several other hikers already settled for the night, who were startled by the group's sudden, frantic arrival. Between gasping breaths, they tried to explain what had happened, but their story was disjointed and seemed implausible even to themselves in the relative safety of the populated shelter. The following morning, one of the other hikers, a man in his 60s who introduced himself as Bill, took Jason aside. "That old place you found isn't on any official maps anymore, for a reason," he said quietly. "Back in the 70s, something happened there, something bad enough that the Trail Association rerouted the path and tried to remove all references to the shelter. But you can't erase history completely, and stories persist." When Jason pressed for details, Bill shook his head. "Just count yourselves lucky you left when you did. Not everyone has." The group completed the final day of their hike in subdued silence, each processing the experience in their own way. They had planned to share photos and videos of their adventure on social media, but none of them ever posted about that night. Years later, when the 5 friends occasionally reunite, they rarely speak directly about what happened at the abandoned shelter. But sometimes, when conversation lulls and the hour grows late, one of them will ask, "Do you remember?" And a knowing silence falls over the group, each recalling the voice that asked for invitation and the presence that seemed to enter regardless. Jason, now a park ranger himself in another state, has researched extensively, but found no official records of the shelter or any incidents associated with it. Yet he remains convinced that something ancient and other dwells in that forgotten corner of the Appalachian wilderness, something that occasionally intersects with our world when conditions are right, or perhaps when they're terribly wrong. These 3 stories represent just a small sample of the unexplained encounters reported along the Appalachian Trail, whether attributed to supernatural entities, misidentified natural phenomena, or the psychological effects of isolation and wilderness immersion. They remind us that even in our modern, mapped, and GPS-tracked world, there remain places of mystery and shadow. The Appalachian Trail, winding its ancient path through mountains far older than human memory, holds secrets in its remote hollows and dense forests, secrets that occasionally reveal themselves to those who venture there. leaving them forever changed by the experience. For those planning their own Appalachian adventure, these tales serve not as deterrents, but as reminders to approach the wilderness with respect for its unfathomable depths and the understanding that some questions may never find satisfactory answers.